I'm going to start with the concept of theory itself. It's important, I think, to think about theory in perhaps more complex ways than what we normally in everyday life think about it. I'll move from that into the concept of management studies itself in terms of where the study of communication might fit within that. And then I want to spend quite a lot of time really looking at different kinds of communication theories and to not treat it as a unitary kind of thing with a single theory, but really, in fact, a context in which there are multiple kinds of theories available to us. I'll move from that into the work with the notion of decision making and collaboration in decision making within corporate organizations themselves. I'll be perhaps a little more brief in terms of relationship in public institutions and public communication practices, partly because across the different kinds of boundaries, I know less about that. And at the moment, I tend not to speak much about the United States. Everything is in flux in a very dangerous kind of a situation. And so I will not probably speak much to that. So let me start with the intuitive idea of theory. Um, this is a simple little story that I've begun courses and classes, training programs with over the years, which actually seems to get at some really fundamental parts of what theorizing is about. And it's also at such a simple level that it keeps us away from getting into the real deep academic issues right away. Um, and so I'll start with a story. When I was in the New Jersey in the United States, I lived out in the country in a mostly glass house, which was a kind of beautiful situation to be in because you can kind of blur the inside and the outside. Nature was right there, and so forth. One of the problems, of course, with glass houses is birds. They tend to believe they can fly through them, especially when you have a low set house like this was. Most often, a bird would fly into the window. You'd feel really bad about it. The bird would fall to the ground, brush itself off, and go back to its life as normal, and so forth. But there was a period of time, and this was early in the morning, where every morning as I was waking up, there would be a cardinal that would fly to a branch outside of my bedroom window, look at the window, and then fly crash right into the window. This would happen over and over again. This is not a pleasant way to wake up. And so, I obviously spent a lot of time thinking about what does one do in this situation. It didn't help to scream at it and yell at it, throw pillows at it, or all the kind of things that seem to be very natural in this. And it took me a while before, even as a theorist, I began to think of this in a different kind of way. And that is to think of the situation from the cardinal's perspective and not from my perspective. So, from the cardinal's perspective, the bird gets up in the morning, flies to its favorite branch, and looks out. It doesn't understand that the window, when the sun comes up, performs a mirror function. And so the cardinal sees another cardinal in front of it. From the cardinal standpoint, its built-in understanding of life is the territory is very important. If another bird is in my territory, I must scare it away. And so the cardinal crashes to attack the other bird. The cardinal, of course, looks up and sees that the other bird is gone and feels at the moment some degree of success. So it flies back up to its window and looks out from its branch last and again sees a cardinal has entered its territory. So again, crash into the window. It falls to the ground and looks up and says, that didn't feel very good, but it was successful. The other bird has gone away. And this can continue for some period of time until the sun comes up. From the cardinal standpoint, if we think of it in this way, the problem that the cardinal sees is not its own decision-making process. It rather is the tenacity of the other bird. That is, no matter how hard it attacks, the other bird is able to sustain it and return. Now, what does that got to do with theory? I would argue that I, as well as the cardinal and others, are operating with an implicit theory about how life works. The cardinal is largely in seeing another bird in the territory, feels the need to attack that bird. Mine may be also largely instinctual initially, until I actually read about cardinals and territoriality and the reflection of mirrors and so forth, and I was able to cover my window. Up until that point, I operated as a human being with an understanding that what am I going to do about this thing? I must fight back against it, and so forth. What I call these is implicit theories, and they work precisely because they have a glitch built into them. And we can see a glitch built into them whenever we see, as we saw in the Cardinals case, something that we might call deja vu. That is, the same thing happens over again. And even as I try harder, even as I try longer, even as I try louder, the same thing happens over again. We believe that we don't self-correct in these situations because we perceive a marginal success. We have a concept of how it should work, and like the cardinal, we perceive at the moment that we were moderately successful with what we did. We then displace the responsibility for the failure outside of ourselves. In this case, in the cardinal's case, perhaps the tenacity of the other bird. So these implicit theories are very important to us because they not only give us an instruction for how to behave, they give us an instruction for how to determine success and failure. They begin to account for the kinds of ways in which we fail in a situation, in fact, can repeatedly fail in a situation. Now, when we turn to everyday life as human beings, we see this same thing happen over and over again. I know companies that have the same failure over and over again. For example, they cut costs. They find that the cutting of costs momentarily gave them a bump on their quarterly report, but soon they were losing more money than before. And so the response is to cut costs more deeply. Again, they see a momentary gain, and in the long run, they see that it doesn't turn out. In fact, it has a negative effect. And they can continue this cycle for any number of times. Governments do the same thing of applying the same kind of a failed logic in new situations with a momentary perception of success, but at the same time, finally have failure. And we do this in probably smaller ways. One of the things I find almost universally in organizations is that people hate meetings. They feel like they're time consuming and wasteful. And yet they perform meetings almost the same every time, go back and complain about it, and yet come back in and set up the meeting in the same way and end up failing with the meeting in the same way. So I want to talk about two kinds of theories. What I've been talking about at this point are what we might call implicit theories, the basic, everyday, common sense understanding about how life works. These become so deeply embedded within our thinking, and in the human case, they may get embedded with it, our institution, our institutional practices, and so forth. In the cardinal's case, they're instinctual, but there are institutions and institutional practices that are not very different than an animal's instinct. They function really in the same way of a gathering of collective knowledge, of being a kind of common sense approach to things, and something we enact in these situations. These are what philosophers have called our theories in use. And they differ considerably or can differ considerably from what we might have as our explicit theories. In other words, we might have an explicit theory about communication or about meetings or about management that is quite complex and very rich. And yet, when it comes to actual being in a situation and working, we may fall back on a relatively minor thing. I think of it much like a student studying physics. They've spent years of their life in the university understanding quantum physics. And for good reasons, when they go to measure the dimensions of the room, they think in Newtonian linear physical terms, because there's no reason for them to have this more complicated thing. But if we don't take this complicated thing, we will not know how to fly an airplane efficiently from New York to Rome. We will not understand how to, in fact, send a satellite to space. In other words, our situation requires different things. And if we can't give up our implicit native theories to the more complicated ones when we get into situations that need it, then we have trouble. And so we have a relationship here between our implicit understanding of things and an explicit one that are not always in relationship to each other. Part of my goal in much of my work, as well as in this talk, is to try to build better explicit theories and then figure out ways in which they may become our natural implicit way of understanding situations and working it. In other words, if you think about the cardinal situation, I might want to build a model for the cardinal about what really is happening in the situation. But that won't work unless I can also translate that into the cardinal's perception. So it sits on the branch, it says, I know how to tell the difference between a mirror image of myself and an actual bird that's in my territory. I don't want to lose my ability to protect my territory. I want to be able to discern the difference between the mirror and a bird in my territory. And so that's how we're going to work here. Um, Let me start out with a concept of management, because I think much of our use of communication really begins with how do we think about management, management studies, management science itself. In the United States, most of management studies are aimed at trying to get managers to be able to more able to control a workforce, to manage a work process, and so forth. For that reason, and because it often is narrowly measured by such things as a quarter report, we get a lot of what we might call window bashing in much of our organizational life. And organizations which have a kind of built-in dysfunction that's actually very costly, a cost which is often externalized to external publics, and a cost which is not seen because it tends to benefit a managerial group at the very same time that it harms the organization and harms society. And so I always begin with thinking about management in a different way. That we ought to think about management and management studies is trying to understand and develop practices that lead to decision making that in some way optimally includes diverse social, economic, and ecological values. That the real goal is not to forget about profit. The real goal is to incorporate the understanding of how do we get economic goals aligned with social and ecological ones. We have tons of research to suggest that when we get those three things to align, that we actually have more profit than we do when profit is pursued on its own. If you can think in maybe a simplistic way, you and I all have to breathe to stay alive. But if we decide that breathing is the only thing that's of interest to us, not only do we breathe not very well, but we lose everything about life that we would breathe for. And so when we think about profit as a necessary part of organizational life, it is different to think about it as a necessary part of that and to think about it as the end goal and only thing that we are worried about. And so I want to think about this in more complicated ways, that whenever we think about management, we're really trying to think about a way of optimally including a number of values and getting them to be represented. If this is the case, then management is not so much about compliance gaining and persuasion and control as it is about figuring out useful ways to use conflict. Most management tries to bury conflict, to suppress conflict, to get rid of conflict. Well, what I'm talking about here is attempt to use conflict for the development of more creative answers to the kinds of situations that management finds itself. And to use conflict means that we have to in some way respect the inclusion of individuals who are different, a wide number of values that are different necessarily from managerial values, and to put them into place. But the management practice learns to be able to optimally relate to those in such a way to get a creative answer to things. So let me turn then for a second to communication, because here too, we have plenty of native theories of communication that are really quite at odds to what our more sophisticated communication theories are telling us. So let's start with the most common understanding of communication and how we think about that within organizations. Um, a few years back, I was asked to write a chapter for a book in critical management studies on communication. And when I was asked, I said, "Are you making this the first or the 14th chapter of the book?" And they were puzzled by the question. And I says, two different concepts of communication. This will be the 14th chapter of the book if you consider communication one of several phenomena that exist in organizations. And therefore, we're talking about organizational communication as a thing that occurs in something that exists called organizations. If, on the other hand, you're asking me to do the first chapter, we'll do what our contemporary communication theory tells us, and that is that communication is at its basis constitutive of organizational life. That is, the individuals, the roles, the knowledge, and so forth are themselves communication products. And in that sense, rather than starting with something which we might call the psychology of organization or the sociology of organization, we have to talk about first the communication concept of organization. And that changes everything. It changes everything from thinking about communication as something we study in organizations, and we think about communication as the most fundamental process by which organizations are produced. That it produces the practices and it reproduces the structures and identities and knowledge. It reproduces the very values that are used in organizational life. So we have here two radically different understandings of what communication is. Most people in everyday life, in their native implicit theories, will think about communication as a thing that occurs in organizations, in the same way that they think about themselves in communication as something that they say or something that they do. And therefore, communication always begins from them outward. This more constitutive view argues that the most important process of communication happen before you speak. It is the formation of you and ideas and knowledge about which you speak. And those communication practices that our explicit theories know quite a bit about are rarely understood as part of our implicit understanding of organizational life. And so let me, to simplify it a little bit, build a chart. And I'm going to have this be a 2 by 2 matrix. And so in a 2 by 2 matrix, we end up with 4 quadrants. And these 4 quadrants, I'm going to argue, are 4 distinctly different kinds of ways of conceptualizing and theorizing communication and management. And so let me build the 2 by 2 matrix for you. So let's start at the top of this and say, let's divide management studies into 2 kinds of management studies. Management studies that are primarily interested in management as a control process, aimed at getting compliance, regulating individuals, and so forth, versus management as seeing itself as a kind of collaborative process by which it tries to include a tremendous number of diverse and mutual interests in their decision making. So we have management on the one hand as a kind of understanding of control, and management on the other hand as an understanding of a kind of collaborative decision process. And the skills of management, of course, are radically different in each of these 2 ways of thinking. And let's now, on the other side of the matrix, uh, build 2 concepts of communication. One, that communication is something one does. It's a phenomena within organizations. And the second, the lower quadrant, being that communication is constitutive. Communication is something which makes or does something, okay? So when we put these together, we have up here in my upper left-hand corner, quadrant number 1. Um, oh, thank you. Okay. So quadrant number 1 is interested in studying communication deeply. And it happens often in the sense of how do we distribute information, the studies of upward and downward communication. It understands a lot about persuasion. To the external world, it does campaigns and public relations and advertising. In other words, if you look at each of these, management is directing something to get someone else to follow organizational objectives or goals in this situation, okay? And so it endlessly focus on very important issues in organization and very important issues in the life of organizations, in the sense that there are reasons why we attempt to control, reasons why we attempt to sell our products, and a reason why we do public relations, okay? Now, recently we see more and more in management studies less interest in this notion of control and expression and more interest when we think about communication as constitutive. And I'm going to call this in a generic way the attempt at cultural management. In other words, within organizations, at some point we begin to realize that people resist control. And it is much more efficient, particularly in knowledge intensive work, work at a distance, and so forth, if we can inculcate the values of the organization into the employee so that the employee would do on their own what otherwise management would have to tell them to do. And here we get into these complicated notions from Foucault and others of self-surveillance, the way in which it operates, the ways in which we produce what we call unwitting consent. And that is that individuals here are consenting to a set of values and so forth that they have not chosen for themselves, but have been inculcated. Even in advertising, we see increasingly an interest in not selling the product per se, but selling the kind of human being who needs that product. So we're producing people with identities, producing a particular kind of knowledge. And, we see in some contexts, even governments being very active in the cultural management process, because if you control people through controlling their interiors, their hearts, minds, and souls, it's easier and gets less resistance than to try to direct and control people. If you can establish the processes of knowledge construction, you don't have to sell people on your knowledge. They will accept the constructed knowledge as it is constructed, as if it was openly their own. Okay? So we have here, if you wish, since at least the 1980s, in management, two kinds of controls going on, and differing times in which people are primarily interested in doing cultural management, cultural change processes, and other times when they're much more interested in doing direct management, which focuses on strategy and so forth. Okay, so that gives us quadrants, well, I call them 1 and 3 here, both based in a concept of management, but in two different concepts of communication. So let me turn to the other side of the quadrant. Even with the implicit idea of communication as a kind of influence and control, to a large extent, even when management thinks of itself as coordination, collaborative decision-making, and brings people in, it can bring in with it that concept of communication. In fact, most of what we call in the world and in organizations as liberal democracy does exactly this. It focuses on the freedom of individuals' ability to speak. It focuses upon the notion of equal opportunity to speak. It focuses on the concept of human rights and public forums for expression. And this becomes the democratization, in many cases, of organizations. It becomes part of what many of the stakeholder models do. That is, let's bring in representatives, let's give them a place to speak, let's have another meeting. Okay? It's also, unfortunately, the reason why often meetings fail, and many of these attempts at stakeholder collaboration simply collapse in their own weight. Because let's think of it in this way. So if we believe that people are able and have their own meetings and can speak freely, we can have a meeting, we can have a discussion. But that itself doesn't give us a decisional process. And even worse than that, if we believe that cultural management has already occurred, then we'll find that this concept of liberal democracy inevitably fails, because the meanings that people are speaking are meanings that somebody else has constructed for them that they now carry into this situation. Okay? And so many of the democratization processes only even are allowed in organizations when they've already done significant cultural management. Because if you've already done significant cultural management, then democratization has people buying in and appearing to choose on their own the things that others have already determined as the choices that will be available to them and the way they'll think through them. And so much of the work that many of us are doing in communication theory as it applies to management are really looking at this fourth quadrant, which I call, for the lack of a better term, generative democracy. And this is a kind of democratic concept that says the coming together of people must be based upon understanding the processes of control and inculcation of values and meaning. We must understand that that has occurred, and our process of talk must help us overcome those by retaining diversity, by retaining complex differences in communities, by respecting conflict, to have a way in which people can change from the kind of unwitting consent that they give into an openly achieved consent. And that requires a very special design of communication. So let me spend just a moment here contrasting this idea of a generative democracy to our more typical, everyday, implicit understanding of democracy in this liberal democratic sense. So if we say that the principal problem, okay, let's not go back to the overheads now. I'm going to depart from them a bit. Okay. Can we not share a screen now? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Because I want to divert from that a little bit, and so I don't want it to be confusing. So when we think about this notion of generative democracy, we believe that its most basic attempt must be to overcome the limits of a liberal democracy. And let me look at four ways in which that might occur, or issues that get involved with that. First of all, liberal democracy always presumes that people already have meaning, and the problem of communication is the expression of them. And therefore, in the meeting, when we say everyone should have a right to speak, everyone should have their say, it presumes that there's no reason why we should question what people bring to the meeting as being their own that they want to express. Our more constitutive communication theory says we should always question that. We always come in with a set of social formations, and these formations are across at least, several different areas of life. For example, that we know from a lot of research that the very interior, the feelings that we have, what we call our emotions, in terms of the kind of management of emotions, is always socially constrained and socially produced. These are not spontaneous things in ourselves. This is a combination of spontaneous things that we feel with the kind of social interpretations of them. So even at the most basic level of our feelings, we carry these into meetings as an already constructed thing through past communication practices. Similar with our identities, the very idea of an employee or management or male or female are already active social productions within a communication process that we now carry into our liberal democratic meetings. And therefore, if we are not questioning them, we treat them as being natural and self-evident rather than produced, then our meeting simply is reproducing a cultural inculcation that's already occurred. Similarly, with the social norms, the kinds of knowledge and knowledge processes in an organization, even the most basic things like accounting are social practices. Accounting is not something given in some objective way. It's a social production that accounts things in some way and does not count them in other ways. And we can go further than that into even the kind of narratives that seem to organize organizational life. So first of all, we're going to contrast here. What happens in liberal democracy is that we carry in, without investigation, a tremendous number of social productions and hence reproduce them in these contexts. And therefore, the meeting has this quality of being a reproduction of something that we have never investigated. The second is the very notion of reciprocity that takes place in these two forms of democracy. In the liberal democratic version, reciprocity is assured by making sure everyone has a say. And in having everyone have a say, we treat that as if it is reciprocal, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is there that should be there, that everybody who has a say is in fact being heard. In other words, reciprocity ought to be based not in the ability to speak, but reciprocity ought to be based in the ability to speak one's own meaning and have one's own meanings heard. And if we speak others' meanings, it doesn't help us. If we speak meanings that no one is listening to or doesn't get heard, it doesn't help us. And therefore, we need a more complicated notion of reciprocity that does an investigation of the social constructions to help guarantee that there are, in fact, our own. And in that investigation, make sure that we have a capacity that they're actually heard and not simply said. Third, when we look at most meetings from a liberal democratic standpoint, we have a problem of when we have conflict. In other words, if we have everybody saying what they think and so forth, and we have conflict, what do we do with that? The most likely outcome in most liberal democratic situations, the liberal democratic meetings and organizations, is that we vote, as if voting is the best way to adjudicate our differences. We do not use our differences as a way to invent. And in fact, voting inevitably simply leaves part of the people unhappy and others happy. Instead of trying to find some way in which we can use our conflict to generate creativity, the voting becomes a bailout on democracy rather than a way of doing democracy, which becomes inventive, which we would see in the more generative form. And finally, in the notion of representation, I do a lot of stakeholder meetings, and everyone, when they think about representation, make sure this group and that group and that group is there. But that kind of representation does not guarantee that we have difference in the situation, nor that we have the kinds of interaction that can produce creativity out of that difference. And so we want to think about, in this generative democracy way, not only a set of ways that we can critically look at what we bring into the meeting, but also how we can build a decisional process based in careful interaction designs that move us toward creativity rather than bailing out to such things like voting. So, all our research suggests that more collaborative organizations do better. When we look at high performative organizations, we constantly get this betterness. When we look at the ways in which we look at diverse values and situations, we get this betterness. The difficulty is that people, when they think about collaboration, often think about it in a kind of liberal democratic mode and are frustrated because they don't feel as if it gives them anything that they didn't have already going into the meeting. So the real concept here is to do two different things that are very important. One is to be able to critically examine what people bring in. In other words, if the meeting and if the work across different groups of people cannot critically examine construction, then we have a problem. Critical studies for a long time have looked at this as really looking at two kinds of examinations that are needed to be done here. First, we've always referred to as systematically distorted communication. That is, what are the structural and systemic limits to the ways in which people form the meanings that they have? To investigate the kind of power relationships, the underlying institutional structures, and so forth that lead us in these cases, both the structure and the very systems of interaction, that lead us to continue to reproduce meanings that are not our own, to bring those into situations that are not known. So the critical examiner of those frequently looks at ideological critique, And that is, how do we understand how values get embedded within things that have not been investigated, cannot be brought to the notion of investigation. So part of what we do here is a more standard kind of critical look to try to understand these social production processes. That is, what is happening in communication that might lead it to be systematically distorted. The second is to look at the interaction process itself. What we find is a lot of human interaction, because of the native theories we bring in, are filled with what we call discursive closures. A discursive closure is simply the processes that we use to keep us from talking about things that are important to talk about. One of the most common ways of those is what we call naturalism. Naturalism is a thing that we do in a meeting which suggests that this is, for example, organizational structure, natural rather than a human production. And again, let me go back to a very simple example to get at that kind of difference in how it works in interaction. When my younger son was learning to play basketball, he became very proficient dribbling with his right hand. And in the game of basketball, especially if you're short like he will be and I am, dribbling becomes very important. And he was really good with dribbling with his right hand. It was the day that I explained to him that dribbling with the right hand will always be known by a defensive player, and they will always block you going to the right. You must learn to dribble with your left hand. And he's very frustrated with this. I put the ball in his left hand, and he kind of bounces it in this kind of weird way that one does when it's not your natural hand to use. And he immediately would shift it back over he would send it to his left hand, only to send it back to his right hand. So I finally said, well, why don't we just tie your right hand behind you so you can't use it at all and stick with the left hand? At some point, he looks at me up in frustration. He says, well, you know that I'm right-handed. That's a move of naturalism. Aristotle answered this long ago in his writings. He said, the fact that you're right-handed doesn't mean you can't make the left hand as strong, okay? But that's a discussion that can't be had as long as we treat the notion of right-handedness as our natural state. When we treat male and female as natural states of being with fixed characteristics, we've stopped the discussion about how this became, how it functions within organizational life. When we treat organizational structure as if it is natural, hierarchy is inevitable for human beings. When we treat it as natural rather than investigate how it came to be and what it does, we have done a discursive closure. We've stopped something, okay? Another way we stop conversations is through a process called neutralization. And that is, we treat things that are filled with values as if they're not. For example, when we talk about management as being objective, what that really means is that if you accept my values, you will be objective. But if it fails to realize that all management practices are filled with values, they're filled with choices that human beings have made based upon value systems that they deploy. Accounting practices are not neutral. They're fundamentally, basically based in a number of choices and values. Do you count a retirement account as a liability or an asset for the company? Becomes a fundamental choice that changes deeply the economic picture of the organization. And therefore, neutralization is whenever we see somebody in a conversation evoking the idea that this is the way things are, the way things have to be, that we cannot change these things, that stops the conversation about where did we get there, how do we do that, what does it mean to do that. I'll give you another, and there's actually hundreds of these that people do. Another is what we call subjectification. Subjectification is that whenever you start pushing a person hard around what they're saying, they say, well, it's just my opinion, as if that should stop the conversation. Instead of when you say it's just my opinion, that actually ought to be the start of a conversation. And and that has often failed in organizational life, this understanding that at any given moment, um, that when we say something like an opinion, that is an answer in some way. And so that stops conversation. And so what we want to do is to figure out ways that we both can investigate these structural and systemic ways that communication becomes distorted, which is based in power relationships. And we want to understand the practices of interaction that give these kind of discursive closures, that give us the kind of suppression of organizational life. And that's what we're trying to do in this fourth quadrant. When I talk about a generative democracy, we're talking about both understanding communication as constitutive, understanding that the most effective management processes are collaborative, and now developing the kinds of interaction processes that can both work from the idea of constitutive communication and collaborative management processes. So, right now, we believe that most organizational decisions are heavily skewed by unexamined decisional routines, ideology, distorted rationality, a number of ways in which managerial self-interest become involved, these kind of dysfunctional historical constructions. That what we treat as the naturally existing organizations are in fact filled with things that lead them to be irrational in different ways and not be able to represent a full set of values. In many cases, that has become today heavily based upon just simply managerial self-interest. The managers will do many things that are good for their careers, good for their pay, that are not necessarily good for the organization, and are certainly not good for the wider society. Okay. We know that stakeholder involvement matters in organizations, and for most organizations, it's very difficult for them to bring in a complex array of stakeholders to help them in their decision. Even the very most basic notion of it, inclusion, is hard. How to get people there, how to get people to participate, how to set up the kinds of spaces and forums by which people might participate. But beyond inclusion, it takes a lot more than having them there to enable a situation where they might speak. I'll give another very simplistic kind of example. I worked for a while with the Danish government around their workplace practices, which are heavily committed to the notion of employee involvement in decision making. In fact, at that time, they had laws that required that there be, in fact, union members and employees on the board of directors of the company. What they found was a couple problems. The board of director of a putting a worker on a board of governors seemed to be a good idea, but initially they were always silenced. And in being silenced, it didn't matter that they were there. Over time, they tended to begin to identify with the other stakeholder groups and take on stakeholder logics and no longer represent the worker. And therefore, they implemented a process of rotation. But rotation meant that you always had the newest person on the board always being the person from labor. And that didn't give us any kind of interaction. So I said, let me attend a couple meetings. And so I went to the meetings. And the first thing, of course, that struck me as I went to the meeting was we went to a boardroom in a high-rise office complex with glass walls and so forth. And I said, let's just stop at that most basic part of trying to have participation in these decisions. Let us at least have one meeting that is an environment in which the worker is familiar, understands, and is used to speaking up and talking. And so they met in the back room of a bar room. The other members of the board had no idea what to do in this space. They didn't understand how the space worked. They didn't understand the having a drink during their discussions. In other words, everything about this was not them. And guess what? The worker expressed themselves very clearly in this kind of environment, both explaining to them how they had to work in the environment, but also, even more importantly, beginning to describe the kinds of struggles and things that the workers had. So when we think about these kinds of inclusions, we have to think about this in a much more basic way. And we have to think about this as having an interaction process that allows those people, for example, in this case, board members, that cannot simply rely upon their routine understandings of values and decisions, but those have to be dislodged in some way so they may be open to reconsideration across how do you feel? Who are you? What are the rules? What is knowledge? How do we think organizations work? High performance organizations have been better than others. We believe in doing this. When we've done a number of studies over 20, some 30 years now of high performance organizations, what they have been able to do is inevitably find the times and spaces where they need to flatten and quickly find ways in which we are being very exploratory so we can generate creativity and then to move that up. What they're able to do is to come up with kinds of decisions that are very specific in their positive results. Not only are the decisions better in the sense of how do they meet different kinds of needs, but they do that most often by being more creative. The problem of many business enterprises is that creativity is not something built into their ways of meeting and making decisions. And so when we talk about this generative democracy, what we're doing is forefronting processes that force creativity, that get us these kind of things. When we do that, we find that these meetings are not nearly as frustrating because in the old meetings, nothing ever happened that wasn't carried into the meeting. What this means is the having of a meeting itself gives the energy and creativity towards something that could have never happened in the absence of people who are different being put together. It leads to a lot more, not only creativity, but a lot more commitment by people after they've made the decisions to the decisions. It leads to a lot of decisions that are more customized to the really local circumstances and market conditions that they're in. And so we feel like if we can build this new kind of a communication process and design based upon a fundamentally different understanding of communication and how it fits into this more collaborative management process, that we get a number of benefits, a number of payoffs from that. So I've talked a long time. Why don't we pause here for a moment for looking at some questions? And if there's specific things you want me to go back and develop, I'm more than happy to do so. But thank you for listening for an hour. But I wanted to give the package first.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Agradecemos sus palabras. Resultan sumamente interesantes
Thank you very much,
esta
Professor,
idea
for your
de la
remarks.
narrativa de
The
la historia
idea of a new
del cardenal
focus,
siempre resulta
your
muy
story
atractiva
of the
para
cardinal of
poder
the bird,
comprender
it was very
la
illustrative
construcción
to
en
be
el
able to
ámbito de la
understand
teoría,
how we
entender la parte de la
construct
teorización,
theory, to
ese
understand
ejercicio que resulta
theorization,
tan importante
that
en nuestro
exercise
ámbito.
that turns out to be
Y
so important
desde ese
in
punto de
our
vista,
field. And
tengo
from that
aquí una manita
perspective, I wanted to
alzada.
go into a few questions
Entonces,
I have.
voy a
I see
darle
a hand raised over
la
here, so
palabra
I'm going to
a
open up
Hugo
the
Armando Calvo.
microphone to Hugo
Dame
Armando
un
Calvo, who has
momentito
a question apparently.
para
Just a second, so I
permitir
can
como tal
open up
la
his
pregunta.
microphone.
Sandra, hay una pregunta aquí, ¿cómo puedo
Sandra,
yo
there's a question.
permitirle la
How can I
activación
allow
del audio?
people to open up their microphones here?
Sí.
That's our first act of inclusion.
Es nuestro
Bien. Sí, dame un momento, Stan, para permitir la activación.
Just a second so that we can activate the person's microphone.
Bien.
So people can
Hugo, si
ask their
pudieses
questions
hacer la
via
pregunta vía
chat.
chat, te lo
People,
agradeceríamos mucho.
please write down your questions on the chat box.
Vamos a dar un momento. Ya la tenemos aquí.
All right, we are receiving the question.
Si por favor en la sala también pudieran ir incluyendo sus preguntas dentro del chat, se los agradeceríamos mucho.
Everybody with questions, you can start writing them so
Bien.
that we can read them out loud here.
Bien. Bien, la leo para que
All right,
lo
I'll
traduzcan.
read the question.
Se habla en la presentación de la
In
democracia
the
liberal.
presentation, we heard
En
about
ese
liberal
sentido, me
democracy.
parece que se
In
tiene
this
que
regard,
establecer un
I
diálogo
believe that an
epistemológico, ya que esto
epistemological
ocurre mucho
dialogue
con la
needs to be
administración,
established,
y
since
esto
this
nos da
happens a
en
lot with
ocasiones un
management.
sentido de no
And at
estar
many
en
times,
función del
this
tiempo
gives
y
us a
espacio
sense
en
of not
relación al
taking
contexto.
time and space into account related to the context.
¿Cuál sería la pregunta, Hugo?
So,
Aquí.
which would be your question, Hugo, here?
Bien, tenemos otra pregunta.
Okay, we have another question,
están,
so we'll move on to that while we get clarification from the other comment.
Ok. Nos dice,
Oh, okay, we have a
lo
question
vuelvo a
here.
repetir para que
Let me
quede
just
más,
repeat it so
claro.
that
Nos dice,
everything is
se
clear.
habla en
So
la
we heard
presentación de la
in the
democracia
presentation,
liberal.
we heard
En
about
ese sentido,
liberal
me parece que
democracy.
se
In
tiene
that
que
sense,
establecer un
I
diálogo
believe
epistemológico,
that
ya
an
que esto ocurre
epistemological
mucho con la
dialogue needs to be
administración. Y esto
established,
nos da
since this
en
happened a
ocasiones
lot
un
with
sentido de
management,
no
and
estar
many
en
times it
función del
gives us
tiempo y
an
espacio en
idea of
relación al
not being,
contexto.
not
¿Qué
taking into
podemos
account
hacer
time or
para
space
que la
into the
administración
context. So what can
cobre
we
un
do so that
sentido
management
científico?
can have this scientific sense of a new approach?
Mhm. I think there are two issues for management with this. The first is their own perceptions of their limited time, how busy they are, and so forth. It tends to lead them to not want to open up these wider discussions. They consider it more efficient to simply give instructions or fall back on routines that they have. They don't calculate in the long run that those things tend to be dysfunctional and, in fact, very expensive to the organization. So I think the first is to figure out ways of constructing spaces for management to actually engage in these kind of reflections and to show the long-term benefits of those. The second, I think, is a skill question. One of the problems I think we have with liberal democracy is the kind of presumption that it's natural. And therefore, if you put people in a room and stir, they'll be democratic. It's not. I would argue that probably being democratic is one of the most sophisticated human skills that we've ever been asked to develop. It requires incredible degrees of empathy, abilities to listen, abilities to conceptualize things that are different, ability to clarify our own thinking. And these are not skills that managers are really given. We don't think about management education as focusing on listening and empathy, ability here to know how to ask the right questions, how to be able to be creative, because most of management, they learn to do public speaking, they learn to express things. So I think we need two things. We think we need to understand why spaces need to be made because the long-term consequences of not doing this are great. And the other is we must provide the kind of skill training and so forth, the management that they currently do not have. I hope that helps.
Gracias. Tenemos otra pregunta de Andrea Estivalet.
Thank
Nos
you. We have a
pregunta lo
second question
siguiente.
from Andrea
¿Cuál es su
Stivalet. She asks
perspectiva
the
de
following.
incluir en las
What is your
organizaciones a
perspective
las
of
personas con
including
dificultad
in different
para
organizations
comunicarse,
people who have
pero que están
difficulties
inmersos en el
communicating
entorno laboral?
but are
Por
experts
ejemplo,
in the work
personas
environment? For
neurodivergentes
example,
o
people
con
with
una
neurodiverse
discapacidad que
contexts
impide
or
una
with a
comunicación
certain
normal.
ailment that allows
¿Cómo
them not to
incluirlos?
have this normal quote unquote communication. How do we include all people?
Well, again, I think there are a couple of different things. The one is, of course, it's a skill question. I'm one of those people. I am heavily dyslexic. I have a lot of trouble with a lot of words and names. You wouldn't hear it because I can work around it and I'm old. Um, but it requires a lot of both an empathy for that. Um, there are a lot of people that if I mispronounce one word, they write me off. Uh, and so you have to understand that that can't be done. And so there has to be a certain kind of comfort with sometimes it takes longer for people to form ideas. It takes a lot more effort in trying to figure out how to design questions that evoke a kind of response from somebody that is fairly difficult to do so. And even quite apart from the neurodiversity that may exist, social class and everything else works in much the same way. There are lots of reasons why people find it very difficult to talk within certain kinds of contexts. And in every case, the problem is that we expect everyone to quickly come up to speed and being everyone's responsibility themselves to somehow make it work and fit in. And we have to reverse that. We have to see that it is endlessly the responsibility of the group to make sure that they're listening, understanding, giving opportunity, being empathetic towards the kinds of difficulties that people have. And again, I spread this broadly. I mean, a meeting after meeting where women are excluded, meeting after meeting where people who have trouble with a particular language are excluded, meeting after meeting where people, they're all the same issue. I mean, it is simply a matter of respecting enough to say that despite the difference that exists, we want to and need to hear what is being expressed. And certainly, uh, somebody with any number of different conditions that might be considered neurodiversity, they bring a perspective. I mean, one thing we know, for example, even people like me that are dyslexic people also tend to be more creative. It simply takes a while to get to the process by which that can occur. And that's true of almost every difference that we may want to see. A person that is in different ways more introspective, more introverted, they simply need to be brought into conversations in different ways.
Bien, doctor. Otra pregunta de Blanca Telles nos dice, profesor, felicidades por su labor.
Thank you, Blanca
¿Podría
Telles.
darnos su
Professor,
opinión de cuál es el
congratulations on
papel de
your
la
work.
comunicación
Could you give us your
organizacional
opinion on
en los
what's the
riesgos de
role of
trabajo,
organization communication
específicamente en
and
el
work
psicológico?
risks, particularly for the
Ah, no, en el
psychological
psicólogo.
risk?
Sí, en el psicólogo.
But specifically at the psychologist?
Mhm. Um, well, there are so many different ways to go with this. Um, I think I mean, organizations for a long time have created a lot of psychological risks for individuals. The kind of control processes, the exclusion of people with different characteristics have always led to risk. The abuse of power and the ways in which the abuse of power has entered into organizational life has been very costly to individuals as well as, of course, to the organization. Um, and I think again, what we have changed in, I think that has made a difference, is that we have changed from making believe that the kind of psychological safety issues fall upon the individual who is being hurt. And therefore, programs are need to be developed toward them and to enable them to survive the organization, rather than looking at the kind of systemic processes in an organization that create hurt. Because for every individual that is psychologically harmed, there are a ton of individuals that have learned to live with it to the expense of themselves and the organization. I mean, the degree of burnout, the degree of different ways in which abusive practices in the workplace end up being abusive practices at home, the subtle ways in which women are excluded from conversation and the psychological pressures and harms that comes from that. So I think that we learn from looking at the more extreme case of psychological safety and how organizations do harm to understand that we need to shift from thinking about the harmed individual to thinking about the systemic ways in which harm is reproduced and protected within organizational life. And so the psychologist has a bigger job. The psychologist has to really get into these larger communication practices and processes that are largely constitutive of organizational life and the types of ways in which they both harm specific individuals in specific ways, but also generically harm organizational life and people across the organization.
Bien, tengo un grupo de preguntas
All right, I have a
en
set of
la
questions
participación de Daniel
here
Cortázar. Las
from
voy a leer.
Daniel Cortázar.
Dice, estas son mis preguntas
I'm
en
going to read
relación
them.
con la
These
capacidad
are
de
my
las
questions
organizaciones tradicionales
regarding the
para
capacity
aplicar
of traditional
prácticas más
organizations
inclusivas.
applying
¿Qué
more inclusive
distingue a un
practices.
enfoque democrático
First, what distinguishes a
generativo de
generative
las formas
democratic
simbólicas
approach
o
from
instrumentales de
symbolic or
participación en las
instrumental
organizaciones?
forms of participation
¿Cuáles
in
son las
organizations?
limitaciones prácticas
2.
de
What are
implementar
the
una
practical
democracia
limitations of
generativa en
implementing
organizaciones
generative
altamente
democracy in
burocráticas
highly
guiadas por
bureaucratic
una
or
lógica de la
profit-driven
maximización de beneficios?
organizations?
¿Y es
And
factible
3,
la
is
democracia
generative
generativa
democracy
sin cambios
feasible
fundamentales en la estructura
without
organizacional
fundamental
o en la
changes to
lógica
the
de las
organizational
empresas
structure
capitalistas?
or logic of capitalist enterprises?
Right. Okay, I'll try. Each the three very big, very complex questions. So let me start with the first one, and that is that I'm trying here to work with a concept that works against strategic communication as the principal ways in which we operate. This is not to do it away. If you think about my son, the ability to go left does not mean you're not good with your right hand. It is simply to recognize a situation and circumstances where something is needed that is very different. It's particularly difficult, obviously, to put a more generative approach into a highly bureaucratic organization. And especially where the bureaucratic organization has a strong notion of what profitability looks like. Most bureaucratic organizations are not very profitable. They're not profitable in the long run. And no one is willing to admit that it's the bureaucratic organization that keeps them from being adaptive and profitable. Bureaucracy is, in fact, one of the best window bashing examples I can ever think of, because bureaucracy has a remarkable ability to fail, continue to fail, and yet reproduce the same solutions. I often look at GM in the United States. You know, how did one of the car companies that totally dominated the American market for years be somewhere like 12th on the list of sales? It took work. I mean, it didn't happen to Ford. It didn't happen to other companies. They had to work at doing that, making systemic choices to accomplish that. And they don't see that they actually had to do a lot of work to fail, but they did. And so I think when we look at these things, we have to first start out with the idea that bureaucratic organizations have their own systems of reproduction. They have their own belief in profitability. They have their own belief in these things, each of which have the same characteristics that that poor cardinal had. Now, can we massively transform a bureaucratic organization? Probably not. There are real heavy reproductive mechanisms that exist within that. Can we change profitability to understanding that greater profitability happens when you don't pursue it? That's a byproduct of good practices rather than itself the thing that you should do. That's very hard. But in every organization I know, there are places that you can do it. In other words, we don't have to give up the whole thing because we can't do it everywhere. The question is, where can we do it? Where does it have the greatest benefit of doing it? And can we then leverage the places where it's been successful to gradually overcome the places that we are seeing the continued failure to take place? And so I think it's important to get the concept clear, to get the kinds of concepts and skills that are needed to accomplish it, and to find places that we, in fact, can implement that. And in implementing in those places, gradually work against the bureaucratic structure. And the other is that we are gradually building organizations that are not bureaucratic in this way and don't think about profit in this way. In the United States, among other places, what we call B Corps, that is benefit corporations, are now being chartered in a number of different places, which explicitly start out with the logic that we are triple bottom line companies. We have indices to measure triple bottom line performance, and we're finding that these companies are highly profitable. As we see these companies as being highly profitable, even though they don't pursue profit as their end, it begins to disrupt the logic of bureaucratic organizations. Again, I mean, if I could overturn bureaucracy in a moment, I would. If I could change the American political system in a moment, I would. But we have to find the places where we can. And we have to find the ways of inventing it where it works, and this then to show that it works. Conceptual arguments do not go as far as empirical arguments. That is, when you can show an actual circumstance in an actual industry where this worked, we get greater benefits than what it is as we keep arguing against capitalism and profit motives and all those things about which they already have ready answers. They've answered them for years. They have power to overcome the answers that we give them back. So we have to think about it in a different way. We have to think about where can we do it? Can we get ourselves skilled in ways to make it work so that when we get the opportunities, we can succeed and show the success? I think I got to the three questions. I'm not sure.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Bueno, mientras alguien más se anima en su
Thank you
caso
very
a
much,
hacer una
Professor.
pregunta, yo me gustaría hacer
I would
algunas
like
preguntas.
to ask a few questions of
Cuando
my own
hablábamos
now, Professor,
precisamente
while
sobre
we wait
cómo
for people to
se estudia
drop
la
other
comunicación dentro de las
questions. So when we
organizaciones y
see
se
how
veía en este caso
communication
que la
is applied
comunicación
within
podía ser
organizations,
vista como un
and we see
fenómeno
that
o en su
communication
caso
could be
como
seen either as a phenomenon
constitutiva a
happening
la
in an
organización,
organization
¿no?
or a
Entonces,
constitutive basis to the
creo que
organization
entonces entender
itself,
que hay
then
procesos
all of this
constitutivos de las
entails
propias
an
organizaciones
understanding
desde el
of
punto de vista de la
constitutive
comunicación, es decir,
processes
la
from the
comunicación
communications point of view. This
constituye a
means
la organización.
communication builds the
A mí me
organization
gustaría
as
saber,
its
sobre
foundation.
todo,
So, under that
cuáles
concept, I
son
would like
el
to
tipo de
know
prácticas
which
o
are the
métodos
kinds of
investigativos que
practices
permiten,
or
digámoslo,
research
hacer
methods
esta
that
observación
could
y
allow us
este análisis sobre
do
estos
this
procesos
proper
constitutivos.
analysis on
Lo
these kinds of
pregunto
processes
porque
while they
desde el
are
punto de vista
constituting
del
a foundation.
enfoque de
I am
procesos,
asking this
¿no?
because, from the point of view of processes
Hay
and
ocasiones
the
en las
way we
cuales, por
think
ejemplo,
about
se habla
processes,
sobre
there are many
la
times where
ontología fuerte
there's a
de
lot of
procesos y
discussion
se
of
utiliza
the
o se trata de
strong
promover
ontology of processes,
que
whether
se
we are
ocupen
trying to promote
filosofías, por ejemplo, de Alfred
philosophies,
Whitehead,
for
de
example,
Henry
Alfred
Bergson,
Whitehead,
de
Henry
Locke, ¿no?
Ferguson,
Para
Deluxe.
analizar
So these kinds of
precisamente
philosophies that are used
los diferentes
precisely to analyze
fenómenos
the
procesuales.
different kinds of
Pero
process
en el caso, por
phenomena.
ejemplo, de la
But in the
comunicación
case, for
y
example, of
entender
communication,
entonces
How do we understand this concept of thinking about communication as a constitutive process in the organizations? So how can we go about research methods? How can we analyze to observe all of these formats?
Mhm. Well, I think I mean, there are two ways that we've typically gone about this. The more traditional way has been to do some form of ideological critique, which basically asks, what are people consenting to? What are the values that are based in that? And can we expose those? And so there is still a strong historical way of what we might call the kind of disclosure. And that is, in what way did this come to be formed? What were the power relationships that existed when they were formed? To whose benefit are these formations? Fairly traditional concepts. We've also developed fairly sophisticated forms of discourse analysis, different forms of mostly critical discourse analysis, that is a way to get at the actual process as it occurs. In other words, if we take something like gender, right? If we take the notion of gender as something that exists, then we look at how do women speak, how do men speak, and all those kind of questions. When we look at it as a constitutive thing, we might ask the question in a particular meaning, where does gender become something which exists? How is it treated? How is exclusion done? How is it improved? Do we have the kind of man speak kind of stuff taking place within those meetings? How is it responded to? And so there we get the actual processes of discursive closure. We get the processes by which we, in fact, normalize certain kind of practices. Um, and so the kind of critical discourse analysis gets us back to not only what ideological critique shows, and that is how does these formations exist and to whose advantage, but into what is the actual reproductive process in human interaction. A structure and system cannot just exist. It has to be endlessly reproduced. And so the discourse analysis gets us into the reproductive practices. How does bureaucracy not only exist, but how does bureaucracy reproduce itself in the specific moments of human decision making? And so I think those are what we might consider the two most basic methods of doing so. And we see some people doing, like, say, conversation analysis. I don't think that's deep enough. I think it has to really be a critically informed discourse analytic technique to really get at the kind of processes. We've have some people here who've done research just on environmental stakeholder interactions around the notion of discursive closure, just taking that little piece of it. And they find the endlessness of the cutting off of certain discussions, that they cannot be had in these contexts, the marginalization of people that want to have those discussions. And so it doesn't take long to, even with taking at one piece of this, to start seeing some of these processes occurring.
Bien, muchas gracias, doctor. Nada más,
Okay, thank you very much,
en el caso de
Professor.
Daniel Cortázar,
In the
hace
case of Daniel
una breve
Cortázar, he
respuesta
asked the
al
question, and
comentario
now
que
we
usted
have a
emitió
brief comment to
de sus
your
preguntas. Dice,
answers.
Okay.
He says,
muchas gracias.
yes,
Hay
thank
muchas
you
cosas
very
en las que
much.
pensar sobre
Many
las
things to
organizaciones
think about current
actuales,
organizations,
tales
such
como las
as
empresas ven,
B Corps,
especialmente en lo que respecta
mainly
a
about
en lo que respecta a las metodologías para
mainly
estudiar
about
estas formas
organizationales
organizacionales
to
diferentes
study
o nuevas.
these different quote
Esa es
unquote or
una
new quote
respuesta que
unquote
nos está
forms of
dando, un comentario que
organization.
nos
So
está
that's
dando Daniel.
Daniel's
Y
comments to
tenemos
your
una,
answers.
una,
And we
una
have
última
one
pregunta de
last
Blanca Telles
question by
Girón,
Blanca Telles
Girón,
Girón.
perdón, que nos dice, doctor, ¿qué futuro
She
le
asks,
augura a la
Professor,
comunicación en las
what
organizaciones a
future can
nivel
we
global?
expect
Porque
for
creo que en
organizations
países
on a
como
global
México
scale? Because I
no se le
believe that
da
in
la
countries
importancia debida.
such as Mexico, these issues are not properly taken care of or taken into account.
Well, let's start out by saying that my business is not predicting futures. My business is making futures. And the future we have is the future we make. Um, there are a number of trends that are very hard to predict at this point in terms of how they will work out. Uh, AI is going to be disruptive across industries, across occupational groups, including education. I can't begin to predict how that will work out. I've written some papers on it. I've actually shared some with some of you of my own take upon it. Um, it's a very mixed sort of thing, and I believe that people who are able to scrutinize AI and use it smart will benefit. I fear that there are a lot of people that will use it to cheat, like our Secretary of Health and Education did, basically ask the AI to do a report and find it, half of it is erroneous. So I think the hallucinations are there. I think they're real. I think the environmental cost of these data centers is extraordinary, and no one is taking into account the cost of these data centers. You know, the latest analysis says that, it's more than a liter of water every time you ask AI to do an email for you. Multiply that by billions, and we don't have that kind of fresh water supply. And so, I think that's a disruptive piece of this that's hard to predict. The other, of course, part is what is tariffs and the kind of disruption of the international economic order going to do, which is also fairly hard to predict here. I think in the fairly short term that all nations will benefit from the United States isolation, that you will develop your own industries rather than relying upon American industries, that this will be a time when science will greatly jump ahead in other countries of the United States, because not only scientists will move to the countries where they can do their science, but also there will be an investment in science. We certainly have seen this in Europe. They've certainly incredibly increased their scientific budgets, and innovations coming from that based upon the United States' withdrawal from these areas and the kind of stupidity that's taking place within the United States. Universities will gather tremendously bright students that otherwise would have gone to the United States. So these are two disruptive factors I think are hard to predict. I guess I go with Martin Luther King, that when you look at the long history, the trajectory of the long history is toward greater inclusion, toward taking into account wider sets of values, of getting rid of processes of discrimination, of taking a more sophisticated look at how power actually operates and the cost of existing power relationships. I think that continues. Even something like gay rights in America has taken a tremendous step backwards in 3 months' time. On the other hand, the trajectory across longer periods of time is that we have tended to accept difference in ways we haven't before. Women, if I look at, I'm old, so, I grew up in the 1950s. If I look at how women were treated in most countries at that time, the kind of rights and things that they had, despite recent setbacks and tremendous kinds of costs to women, the trajectory is still moving in the direction of greater equity and greater rights, greater choices, more active choosing of their own futures, and so forth. And so I think that trajectory is there. I do believe that there will be a gradual move to something. B Corp may be too simple of a move toward it, but the notion of C Corps that are totally based upon profit and stockholder generated thing, I think that will gradually go away. I can't imagine that we're going to allow the kind of billionaire influence that we have over a long period of time. In the short term, it's executive salaries in the United States are absolutely out of sight. They're not being taxed. They're at historical levels that are just unbelievable. And the historical levels of executive salaries in America put pressures on executive salaries in every country in the world. And that has to be pulled back. I mean, we have to become more triple bottom line, and we have to put management, its cost into the line with what it costs for other forms of labor. How AI will impact that, I don't know. And how the new kind of world economic order will impact it, I don't know. I'm an optimist. I mean, I always use a quote by Raymond Williams, and you know, my job is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. And I can easily make despair convincing for you. But I believe that we do have choices, and I think academics will be an important part of those choices. I think they have to become articulate in real world kind of context and not be theoretical only. I've tried to model that myself, that I try to work in real companies and to keep myself there, as well as to understand the real practical difficulties of implementing some of the practical ideas. And some people consider me dirty because I do that. Somehow you're not less pure because you've worked in an industry, and I'll accept that. I mean, because I believe academics have to play a role in this. I don't think they can do it from the university alone. I hedged the answer, I understand. Yeah.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Bueno, yo solamente
Thank
haré
you
un breve
very much,
resumen
Professor. So let
de
me
pues, su
provide
presentación.
a
Yo
brief
le
summary of the
agradecemos mucho
professor's
en general su
presentation. Thank
participación.
you very,
Es
very much for
interesante
your
finalmente
participation. It was
continuar con el
very,
discurso
very
sobre que
interesting
la
how
administración no
the
solamente debería
discourse is being
centrarse en
reproduced.
la
The
eficiencia,
discourse
¿no?
about
Sino en
management not
prácticas
only
que
needing to
integren
focus on
valores
efficiency, but
sociales,
also
valores
practices which
ecológicos,
integrate and include
en
social
donde
values,
finalmente
ecological values,
también se
a
reconozca
context
que
where, at the end of
no
the
se
day,
deba de
we also
suprimir como tal
acknowledge
el
that
conflicto, sino más bien aprovecharlo
conflict
como
shouldn't
una
be
fuente de
repressed or
creatividad e
suppressed, but
innovación, ¿no?
leverage it as a source of
Y
creativity and
sobre todo de
innovation.
alguna forma
And
entender la
particularly being
importancia de
able
la
to
comunicación
understand
como este
the
elemento
importance of
constitutivo de las
communication as a
organizaciones, ¿no?
constitutive
En el
element
sentido de
in
que
different
finalmente las
organizations,
organizaciones
in the
se vuelven
sense that
prácticas comunicativas,
organizations
¿no?
need
Y
to
que
implement
finalmente al volverse
communication
unas prácticas
practices,
comunicativas
not only
permiten la
phenomena, and
instauración
these
de
becoming real
identidades, de
practices, they
valores,
allow
¿no?
organizations
Yo
to
creo que ese es
reproduce
uno de los aspectos
identity,
que resulta
values, and this is
altamente
one of the
importante dentro
aspects
de la
that
participación
turns
que
out to be highly
tuvimos.
important.
Y bueno,
And
pues no me
that is
resta
something
más
really
que
important that we
pasarle
learned in today's
la
presentation.
voz
Okay,
a
so
el
now I will
doctor
pass the
Germán
microphone
Vargas
to
con el
Professor Germán
objetivo de que
Vargas,
clausure como tal la
who will
conferencia
provide
y
us
nos
the
estaremos
closing
despidiendo
remarks
con
of
ello.
this
Muchísimas
lecture.
gracias.
And we will be closing our series
Doctor
with this.
Germán,
Thank
si
you very
pudiera
much, Professor Germán. If you
atender
please,
y darnos unas palabras.
may provide us
Sí,
with your
adelante.
closing
Primeramente,
remarks.
disculparme en este
Yes,
problema de
thank you
comunicación
very
por
much. First of
haberme
all,
incorporado
I'd
un
like to
poco
excuse
tardíamente
myself for
y no
coming
haberle dado
a
su
bit
bienvenida,
later
doctor
to
Deetz.
the series of the
Por su
lecture and
interesante
not introducing you, Professor
charla
Deetz. I
y
am very sorry I
conferencia
was a bit
magistral.
late. It was a
Porque
great
la
keynote
teoría de la
speech.
comunicación es importante para
Communication
los estudios
theories
de
being
gestión
important
que se
to
imparten en este
management
ciclo
studies.
de
This is part
conferencias
of this lecture
Horizontes de la
series,
Administración,
Management in Debate
organizado por
Horizons
posgrados
of
integrales en ciencias
Management. This is
administrativas,
organized by the
fundamentalmente para
postgraduate
enriquecer la
study course
formación del
in
alumnado,
administrative
quienes
sciences.
constituyen el
We
público
wanted to
objetivo.
bring this topic to
Como
our
antes a
students.
veces negado en la
So,
anterior conferencia que se
as I've
llevó
mentioned
hace
in
un
the
tiempo,
previous
el
conference,
ciclo tiene como propósito fomentar el
this
espíritu
lecture series
integral
has a purpose
del posgrado
to
con la
foster a
participación de las tres
comprehensive
unidades que conforman
spirit
el posgrado.
of unity
Entonces,
between the
pues
three
no obstante,
faculties of the
quisiera
university
señalar
that we
y
cater
destacar
to.
que esta
And I would
iniciativa
also
se
like to highlight
originó
that
en
these
la unidad
courses
Azcapotzalco
were
por parte
first
de los
designed at
profesores,
the
por supuesto, la doctora
Azcapotzalco
Magali
Center
Pérez,
by
el
Dr.
doctor
Magali
Benito
Perez,
León Corona,
Dr.
el doctor
Benito León
Leonel
Corona,
Flores, el doctor
Dr.
Rodrigo
Leonel
Ocampo.
Flores, Dr.
No
Rodrigo
obstante,
Campos, well.
las otras dos unidades, Xochimilco y a
And the
nuestro
other two
Iztapalapa también
sites,
hubo su participación
Xochimilco,
a través de sus
Iztapalapa, were
representantes,
also
el
involved in the
maestro
design
Sergio
of these
Solís
cores through
y
their
la doctora
representative, Mr.
Lorena
Professor
Litay.
Solis
A
and
todos ellos
Professor
les doy mi
Lorena Litay.
agradecimiento
Thank you very
en el
much
nombre del
to our
profesorado y
faculty
solamente
involved
comentar
in the design
rápidamente,
of
puesto que
these
siempre ha sido
projects. And very
característica
quickly, I
su
wanted to
pedagogía,
comment
su didáctica en todas
um,
sus presentaciones.
the
Hoy no es la
presentations
excepción y el tema es
have been
fundamentalmente
great. Today,
interesante.
the presentation
Me
was
parece
excellent, and this
que
topic
una de
was
las anteriores
very, very
definiciones que usted
interesting.
ha tenido
I
son
think one
muy
of the previous
ilustrativas en términos de señalar
definitions
que el
you gave us
lenguaje
were
no
very, very
representa lo
illustrative, saying
existente,
that
sino que produce
communication
lo que
represents an
consideramos
existing
evidente. Lo que usted
basis
hoy
of
desarrolló
the
muy
values. What
ampliamente
you were
fue el
able to
término
share
de
with
la
us today
naturalización.
with the
Entonces,
term
y
of
el otro aspecto que
naturalization
pues
was very
lo destacó mucho en esta
clarifying
ocasión
of
fue
the
pues esta
process.
confrontación del
And
gerencialismo
I
que
loved how
pone
also
toda
you
su
made
acento en el control
generalism
y en
very
realidad
significant,
desde ese
the
punto
how
de
we
vista
should take
los
care
sistemas
of
de
the closing
comunicación
remarks and
convencionales están más
communication
dirigidos a
systems on a
fortalecer
conventional
estos
level.
mecanismos de
That's
control,
always
de tal suerte
addressing
que se
the
llega incluso
reproduction
a
of control
decir que se
mechanisms. And many
controla a
times
través de la
we feel
comunicación.
that we
Me parece
control
que
through
la presentación
communication
ya
amongst
incrucificada, que me
different
parece que ese
organizations.
uno de
So
sus
the
últimos
paradox
textos,
that
pues
you were
aborda muy bien
mentioning
desde un punto diametralmente opuesto. ¿Cómo
was
podemos
very
hacer
clarifying
efectiva
of the
esta
opposites that we
comunicación
live in our
y
daily
cómo afrontar los
organizational lives?
problemas
How can
actuales que
communication
hay para la
help us
administración
face
y que
current
para este
management
posgrado es
issues? I think
sumamente
that was very important.
importante?
And that's
Tenemos
also one of the
aquí
purposes of
en
the
la UNAM
analysis that we do in
algunos
this
expertos en
postgraduate
comunicación,
course.
pero
In
más
our
dirigidos de
university,
la
we have
administración
communication
pública. Usted
experts, but are
mencionó
very
cuestiones
much
como
focused on public
la gobernanza
communication and
yo
public
en la asociación
administration.
con la
You
rama
mentioned
empresarial,
governments
pero que
very
no voy a
briefly at the
mencionar aquí
beginning,
simplemente que es
and we
otro
won't
tipo
get
de
into any
comunicación
details. It's
donde
just
tal
that
parece
it's a
que se
different
trata
kind
de
of
ver cuál es la
communication, and
capacidad
it
de los
might seem
líderes
to
para
be
proyectar sus
the
proyectos
analysis of
y
the
lograr
skill of
lo que
leaders to
usted
implement their
llama la
projects and accomplish
democracia
what you
generativa,
call
que es
generative democracy,
realmente
which
una
was
categoría muy
such
importante.
an interesting and
Perdón por
significant
extenderme un
category
poquito en esta
you
parte, pero
presented.
no quería
I'm sorry I went
dejar
over
colgado
that part a bit, but I
estos
wanted
elementos
to
para manifestarle
reinforce
nuestro
these
agradecimiento
elements. And
para
well, I wanted to express
fortalecer nuestro
my
posgrado.
thank you
Usted ya
to
tiene
you,
mucha
to your
historia.
contribution to our
Lo
course.
conocemos desde
Your
estudios
trajectory is
organizacionales, cuando
astounding. We've
nuestro
known
amigo
you
común, el
for
doctor
several
Guillermo
years when
Ramírez, lo
our friend in
invitó
common, Dr.
a
Guillermo
contribuir
Ramirez,
con
invited
nosotros.
you
Una
to
cuestión
work
como casi
alongside
todas
with
las
us,
que
to
hizo
share with us
nuestro
a
amigo,
lot of your knowledge.
muy, muy
And our
acertadas.
dear
Hoy
friend
le
was
agradecemos que ya no
very
está en
accurate in
estudios
bringing you in.
organizacionales, pero está hoy
Thank
con
you. We
nosotros
thank him.
y ojalá
He's
no sea la
currently
última
no
vez
longer
que lo
working in
tengamos
that
aquí
specific
presente.
area, but we're still in touch, and we'd
Bueno,
like to thank
dado
him a lot for
esta
his contribution as well
introducción
into
breve y a lo
our
mejor un poco
course.
atropellada,
So
pues
thank you for allowing
simplemente
me to
no voy a pedir que
contribute
se pongan de
to
pie porque pues
today's
nos los voy a
lecture.
leer a todos,
And I
siendo
won't
las
ask our audience to
12:09 del
stand up
día.
because I won't able to see
Doy
you,
por
but being
clausurada esta importante
12:39
sesión que
today,
tuvimos
I
y que
close
ojalá
this
sigamos teniendo. Muchas
important
gracias por todo.
presentation we had today. I hope we stay in contact. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, doctor, y hasta luego a todos los acompañantes en la sala y a
Thank
los
you
que
very
nos
much,
están viendo
Professor,
por
and thank
Facebook.
you to all of our audience, both in Zoom and Facebook.
Thank you.
Aquí también se encuentra Rodrigo Campo, que es también responsable del
We have Rodrigo
Museo
Campo
Integral en
here,
Ciencias
also
Administrativas, pero en
coordinator
la unidad
of our
Azcapotzalco con
postgraduate
nosotros.
course, but in the Azcapotzalco unit here, Professor.
Concluimos. Muchas gracias.
So concluding our presentation, thank you very much.